Did Trump just admit to a war crime in Iran? Last week, the United States destroyed one of Iran's largest bridges, but what shocked military analysts wasn't the strike itself, it was what happened next, because shortly afterward, Donald Trump confirmed the bridge wasn't destroyed for battlefield advantage, it was destroyed as a warning, and that raises a dangerous question. Did a US president just admit to ordering a war crime? War is always a theater of destruction. But occasionally it becomes a theater of confession. In striking a major civilian bridge in Iran, and then publicly explaining that the purpose was coercive signaling rather than battlefield necessity, Donald Trump appears to have done something rare in modern American warfare. He collapsed the distance between threat, action, and admission. Whether this amounts, in strict legal terms, to a prosecutable war crime is a matter for courts that will certainly never meet. Whether it amounts to a strategic mistake is another matter entirely. That question is already being answered, in Tehran, in European capitals, and in Washington itself. The episode reveals less about international law than about the evolution of American coercive strategy in an age of personalized power politics. And it raises a deeper question: what happens when infrastructure becomes not collateral damage but policy? From deterrence to demonstration, American presidents have long threatened overwhelming force against adversaries. Yet they have usually kept a careful ambiguity about targets. Even when civilian infrastructure has been struck, as in Serbia in 1999 or Iraq in 1991, Washington has insisted that such targets had military value. Mr. Trump's remarks left from that tradition. According to his own account, the destruction of the Karaj B-1 bridge followed intelligence that Iran might be retreating from negotiations. The strike, he explained, was intended to send a message: tell them to look out their window and watch. The bridge was not merely eliminated, it was performed. This is coercion by spectacle. The logic resembles Cold War signaling, when missile tests and bomber flights were designed to communicate resolve. But there is a difference between proving capability and destroying infrastructure mid-negotiation. One reassures allies. The other destabilizes bargaining itself. If negotiations can trigger punishment rather than compromise, they cease to function as negotiations. The infrastructure war returns. Modern warfare has always oscillated between armies and societies as targets. The industrial wars of the 20th century blurred that distinction entirely. Strategic bombing campaigns in Germany and Japan explicitly aimed to collapse civilian morale. After 1945, the Geneva Framework sought to restore a boundary: infrastructure could be attacked only when it offered clear military advantage. That boundary has never been perfectly respected. Yet it has still been rhetorically indispensable. American administrations from Vietnam onward have insisted, sometimes implausibly, that civilian targets were militarily justified. Mr. Trump's rhetoric abandons even that fiction, threatening to destroy power plants, bridges, and universities unless Iran makes a deal. Reframes infrastructure as leverage rather than logistics. The implication is stark: civilian hardship is no longer incidental to war. It is its instrument. This is not an escalation in firepower. It is an escalation in doctrine. The Karaj signal, the strike on the Karaj bridge, illustrates the strategic ambiguity now confronting Washington's allies. American officials argued that destroying the bridge would impede Iranian weapons transfers. That is a plausible military rationale. Bridges are classic dual-use targets, but the president's own explanation contradicted it. If the purpose of the strike was signaling rather than interdiction, then its meaning changes. It becomes not a tactical operation, but a diplomatic message delivered by explosives. Such signaling is risky. It compresses decision time for the adversary and reduces space for de-escalation. It also encourages retaliation against equivalent targets. Iran possesses many such options: power grids in the Gulf, shipping choke points in the Strait of Hormuz, and cyber infrastructure across Western financial systems all lie within Tehran's asymmetric toolkit. Once infrastructure becomes legitimate bargaining currency, it becomes reciprocal currency. The language of Stone Ages, threatening to bomb a country into the Stone Ages, is not new in American political rhetoric. The phrase has circulated since at least the Vietnam War. But repetition matters less than context. During most earlier uses, the phrase functioned as hyperbole. In the present case, it accompanies a sequence of actual infrastructure strikes and explicit deadlines. Deadlines transform rhetoric into ultimatum, ultimatums transform war into negotiation by destruction. The danger is not simply humanitarian. It is strategic. Infrastructure wars are difficult to calibrate. They escalate unpredictably because their effects are systemic rather than localized. Destroy a bridge and supply chains shift. Destroy power plants and urban governance begins to unravel. Destroy universities and the political elite hardens rather than softens. Pressure rarely produces capitulation in regimes built for endurance, allies, and the credibility gap. European governments have spent decades defending the legitimacy of American military leadership by invoking its adherence to rules-based warfare. That defense becomes harder when Washington appears indifferent to those rules. Mr. Trump's remark that he was not at all concerned about committing war crimes was intended as political bravado. Yet international alliances run on legal language as much as military hardware. If infrastructure strikes become openly coercive tools, NATO's moral narrative weakens. Even governments privately sympathetic to pressure on Tehran will struggle to defend tactics that resemble collective punishment. Strategic legitimacy is cumulative. So is reputational erosion. The university strikes and escalation logic. Reports that strike targeted institutions such as Sharif University of Technology further complicate the picture. Universities occupy an ambiguous position in wartime targeting doctrine. They may host research facilities with military relevance. But they also symbolize national modernity and intellectual continuity. Attacking them sends signals far beyond the battlefield. Such signals are rarely conciliatory. Instead, they reinforce regime narratives of existential struggle, strengthening hardliners who argue that negotiation invites humiliation rather than security. Coercion works best when it divides adversaries. Infrastructure wars often unite them, unleashing the military. The comment by Pete Hegseth that the armed forces had been unleashed captured the deeper shift underway. American military power has historically been framed as disciplined, rule-bound, and technologically precise. The language of unleashing suggests something else: liberation from constraint rather than application of strategy. That rhetorical shift matters. It signals to adversaries that escalation ceilings are rising. It signals to allies that coordination may be falling. And it signals to domestic audiences that war is becoming a test of resolve rather than policy. Wars fought as tests of resolve rarely end quickly. The paradox of coercive destruction. Infrastructure coercion rests on a simple assumption, that pain produces compliance. Sometimes it does. Serbia's leadership yielded after NATO's air campaign in 1999. But Iraq did not capitulate under sanctions. North Vietnam did not surrender under bombardment. Iran itself endured 8 years of war with Iraq without regime collapse. Authoritarian systems often absorb infrastructure damage more effectively than democratic ones. They centralize distribution, ration scarcity, and suppress dissent. The paradox is that destroying infrastructure can precisely strengthen the regimes it is meant to weaken. If Tehran interprets bridge strikes and power grid threats as evidence that compromise invites further pressure, it will rationally choose resistance instead. Law, confession, and precedent. Whether the Karaj strike is a war crime depends on facts unlikely to be publicly verified, intelligence assessments, targeting criteria, and command intent. Yet presidential statements matter regardless of legal outcomes. International humanitarian law runs partly through precedent and partly through expectation. When leaders openly dismiss their relevance, both weaken. Future conflicts, between Russia and Ukraine, China and Taiwan, or Israel and its neighbors, will be shaped by what major powers normalize today. If infrastructure coercion becomes routine, its consequences will not remain confined to the Persian Gulf. They will travel. America's strategic inheritance. The most striking feature of the episode is not the strike itself but the narrative surrounding it. For decades, the United States has justified its military interventions by claiming not only superiority of power but superiority of restraint. Precision weapons, legal reviews and targeting protocols formed part of that claim. Mr. Trump's approach reverses the emphasis. Restraint becomes optional. Demonstration becomes central. Infrastructure becomes negotiable. this is a different theory of American power, less institutional, more personal, less procedural, more theatrical. It may produce short-term leverage, but it risks long-term instability. The bridge as metaphor, the destruction of the Karaj bridge was meant to send a message to Tehran. Instead, it may have sent a broader message about Washington itself. Bridges connect, destroying them rarely improves negotiation. If infrastructure becomes the language of diplomacy, diplomacy begins to resemble war by other means. And when presidents publicly celebrate that transformation, they do more than reshape a single conflict. They reshape expectations about how great powers behave when they believe rules no longer constrain them. The real question is not whether one bridge fell, it is what else fell with it.